Welcome everybody. It's nice to have you back again this morning. It's been a wonderful day and a half so far, and this morning is the final half day of the conference. We finished just after noon, and there's a few little pieces of housekeeping I want to mention. First of all, our little tinkle bell is still with us, calling you to chairs at the appropriate time. The name tags that you have, we have a recycling bin or bins at the back, so if you are leaving early and certainly at the end, please recycle. We do plan to use these again. Thank you so much. They've been planned for multi-year use. Now it's really important again, is Rob, Professor Schroef here, Bob, if you just put your hand up again so you know who you are. Bob used his business magic to enable us to identify the carbon costs of the conference, and they're fully offset, so this is now a carbon-free conference. We had planned this from the beginning, and we achieved our goal. We announced it at the beginning of last week. So again, congratulations to you, Bob. Thanks for doing that for us and sponsoring it as well. Because when you go carbon-free, it costs. You have to write a check to an not-for-profit that is trying to enable that. So it's not a cost-free thing to do. So very much appreciated. Also, as you know, we're trying to be as green as we can be. So we don't have any PDF. We have a PDF schedule on the website for your smartphones, but we don't have any printed versions of that, other than the little handout card that you've got, little bookmark. So if you're looking for detailed scheduling, just open up your smartphones, go online, and download the PDF. We have the same organization this morning. We have a plenary speaker, then we have an hour, a little break, and then we have the two rooms, breakout rooms here and next door, and then we come back for the final panel discussion at the end. It's really important for you, again, to recognize that we are streaming the conference online. This is going out globally. It's a really cool thing, and we're really pleased we've been able to do that. It's by definition then being recorded, so we can access any of this afterwards. And we're doing that for the plenary speaker and for the breakout speakers. So welcome for this final plenary presentation with Professor Mary Wood from the University of Oregon. I'm going to ask Professor Jane Moriarty to come to the podium to introduce Professor Wood. Thank you, Jane.
Good morning. It's great to see those of you who've been here, and it's great to see those of you who are joining us for the first time. I would like to say one thank you before I start, and that's to Jerry McGill, who is the organizer, the leader of this conference, and the driving force. Yeah, this has been fabulous, Jerry, and thank you so much on behalf of all of us. A great interdisciplinary conference is able to weave together various approaches from various disciplines and unite them in a common purpose, which is what we hope to do today, particularly after we hear from our next fabulous speaker. So far, we have heard incredibly compelling presentations from our science speakers. Carl Sagan reminds us science is a candle in the dark. Well, if that is so, we have been illuminated beautifully here on the problems of climate change. The data, as they say, are incontrovertible, whether we believe in science or not. From business, we have learned that sustainability is not only taking root, but actually flourishing and growing and developing, both in the developed nations and, as Helen Manich tells us so compellingly, in developing countries as well. And from ethics, theology, and the humanities, we are provided with a foundation for why we must create a culture of selflessness and a culture of concern for our earth and its inhabitants. They have provided the moral exhortation for us, asking as we sit upon the shore with the arid plain behind us, shall we at least set our lands in order? And the piece that needs to be put into this puzzle to make it work, perhaps, is what we are going to hear from our speaker today. which is, what does law bring to this discourse? What is the role of lawyers? And I would say the role of lawyers is as the foot soldiers for change. We have the template of the civil rights action in the 60s to look at as how lawyers could effectuate change in a positive and meaningful way. As I like to say, in a civilized country, more lawyers, fewer armies. Law can provide the ways and the means toward our common purpose, and no one more than Professor Mary Wood can explain that to us today. So as I was getting ready to invite people, a law speaker, I first asked my colleague Nancy Perkins, who's our environmental law guru and has written compellingly on the issue of sustainability, by the way. And I said, who should we invite? And she said, Mary Woods, of course. And then I called a few of my friends who are environmental professors, and I said, who should we invite? And they said, Mary Woods, of course. This is why we are going to hear from Mary Woods, because she is providing the path to what it is we are hoping to accomplish. Mary Christina Wood is the Philip H. Knight Professor of Law and Faculty Director of the school's Environmental and Natural Resource Law program at Oregon. She teaches property law, natural resources, public trust, federal Indian law, public lands law, wildlife law, and hazardous waste law. She is also significantly the founding director of the school's nationally acclaimed Environmental and National Resources Law program and is faculty leader for the program's Conservation Trust Project, Sustainable Land Use Project, Native Environmental Sovereignty Project, and Food Resilience Project. She is a graduate of Stanford Law School, served as a judicial law clerk on the well-known Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and practiced environmental law with Perkins Coie, which is a West Coast firm. She is the author and contributor of several books. She is the author of a new book entitled Nature's Trust, which was released in October of 2013 by Cambridge University Press. To say she has published extensively is to vastly understate how much Mary Wood has written. She has 20 pages listing her publications. I'm not sure she sleeps, that's what I've decided. She has published extensively on climate crisis, natural resource, native law. But what she has done and what she's going to be talking about today, which I think provides a path forward to our common purpose, is the approach called the atmospheric trust litigation to hold governments worldwide accountable for reducing carbon population within their jurisdictions. Her research is now being used in cases and petitions brought on behalf of children and youth throughout the United States and in other countries. She is a frequent speaker on global warming, climate change, and her sovereign trust approach. Among the things she has accomplished in her life, in addition to being a practicing lawyer, in addition to the work she has done at Oregon Law School, she has also worked for the Department of the Interior. And in doing that, she was an assistant special counsel to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services for the endangered species so-called God Squad. I had to get that in, that's just too cool. Which is an exemption proceeding involving the northern spotted owl. She not only works, she volunteers. She is an active part of the community. She is she's a board member of the Western Environmental Law Center. She's on the advisory board for the Center for Environmental Law and Policy, the Climate and Water Advisory Board, the Tribal Water Advocacy Project, Climate Legacy Initiative, and Climate Legacy Network. She has won multiple awards which should not shock anyone, among them the David Bauer Lifetime Achievement Award. Today, she is presenting us with this path forward and explaining the role of law in helping the fight against climate change. Her presentation is Mary Christina Wood, Nature's Trust, Environmental Law for a New Ecological Age. Please join me in welcoming her.
Well, I am so honored by that introduction, and I am just incredibly honored to be with all of you here today. Thank you for having this very important conference at this crucial moment in time, and thank you, Jane, for those beautiful remarks. We find ourselves alive on this earth at a truly unbelievable moment in time as we face unfolding catastrophic harm on a planetary scale. I come from the West, where it's now bone dry and our forests are going up in flames. In his landmark encyclical, Pope Francis describes the spiral of self-destruction which currently engulfs us, and he makes an urgent appeal for a new dialogue to shape our common future. I am really honored to be with you here as part of that dialogue to provide a perspective from the field of law. Well, I've taught environmental law for over 20 years, and just a bit about that field. It contains statutes passed by Congress in the 1970s, such as the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, and many, many others. And I'm here to tell you, America has no shortage of environmental law. Collectively, these consume thousands upon thousands of pages. And most lawyers look only to these laws for a climate response. But had these laws worked, we would not be facing climate crisis today. Throughout his encyclical, Pope Francis describes the destructive technocratic paradigm under which our modern society operates. This paradigm, he writes, is based on the lie that there is an infinite supply of the Earth's goods, and this leads to the planet being squeezed dry beyond every limit. The Pope urges us instead to create an ecological culture that puts us in cooperation with nature. And as part of that, he does call for a new legal framework that, quote, can set clear boundaries. Our government's climate response under statutory law is very much a product of the technocratic worldview that lies at the root of our ecological crisis. In my time today, I will share thoughts on the dysfunction that plagues our current system of law, and I will describe a different paradigm called nature's trust, that I call nature's trust, which invokes the ancient public trust principle that I believe can promote ecological culture in a way that our statutes fail to. And I will describe how youth around the world are using this approach in pending lawsuits to force a climate response before it's too late. So first, let's consider how we got into this current predicament. The existential threat that we now face did not just materialize out of nowhere. In fact, the prospect of wholesale climate disruption from fossil fuel use has been well known to our government for at least 3 decades. Back in 1986, members of the Senate Environment Public Works Committee wrote a letter to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency recognizing that there is a very real possibility that man, through ignorance or indifference or both, is irreversibly altering the ability of our atmosphere to perform basic life support functions 3 decades ago. The letter asked EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, to develop a plan to stabilize the U.S. share of greenhouse gas emissions, a very logical response. EPA did develop this plan, but it was ignored. And our leaders continued to promote the very fossil fuel regime that scientists warned would imperil our survival on this planet. Moreover, we now know that key corporate leaders in the fossil fuel industry were warned by their own scientists in the 1980s that their exploits would put our world in danger. Yet industry heads refused to own the problem. Instead, they launched a public relations campaign designed to confuse the American public to the threat of climate change. And they also paid hundreds of millions of dollars in campaign finance to purchase influence across our government and thereby forestall any regulation of their industry. This strategy ensured that for the next 3 decades, our government would continue promoting this fossil fuel regime by handing out massive subsidies, easing regulations, issuing permits, not enforcing violations, leasing public lands in offshore areas, and approving export proposals. Government did this on both the federal and state levels. The top fossil fuel producers have collectively reaped more than $1 trillion in profits since the new millennium, while the global damage and human death toll from climate chaos now escalates worldwide. A public trust lawsuit that I will later describe chronicles this ongoing government promotion of the fossil fuel industry and asserts that government defendants have acted with deliberate indifference to the peril they knowingly created. Well, with that history in mind, let us now turn to the reality we face. It is a reality not defined by our human-made laws, but rather by the laws of nature. Nature has certain requirements to keep our planetary life systems in balance, and those laws also determine whether we all survive. While this basic truth has informed indigenous thinking for thousands of years on this continent, it has been suppressed by our modern technocratic worldview. Oren Lyons, a faith keeper of the Six Nations Iroquois Confederacy, explained the concept when he was describing a massive forest die-off in Canada caused by beetles that are now thriving in the warmer temperatures brought on by climate change. And as Lyons puts it, you can't negotiate with a beetle. You are now dealing, he says, with natural law. The thing that you have to understand about nature and natural law is there's no mercy. There's only law. The most basic purpose of our environmental laws is basically to ensure our compliance with these laws of nature. If our environmental law fails to match the reality of nature's laws, then it fails us. Now, if you ask most environmental lawyers whether the law is responding to climate crisis, they will say yes, and take you into a deep dive in the Clean Air Act and talk about the President's most recent Clean Power Plan. But instead, I would ask you first to define what our climate system needs to regain its energy balance. That is the logical starting point, not what our law is doing, but what our climate system actually requires. And then only after we define our reality can we then step back and ask whether our system of laws is meeting that reality. But this is not the approach we've taken in recent history. As Elizabeth Colbert writes, it may seem impossible to imagine that a technologically advanced society could choose in essence to destroy itself. That is what we are now in the process of doing. To answer the question of what our climate system needs to regain its balance, we need to turn to carbon math. 3 years ago, the chief climate scientist at NASA, Dr. James Hansen, led a team of scientists to develop a prescription for the planet designed to restore climate balance at 350 parts per million atmospheric carbon dioxide. That's carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. 350 parts per million is widely thought to be the upper safe limit of pollution, and it correlates to about 1.5 temperature rise Celsius. But as many of you know, we are now in the danger zone with CO2 levels climbing over 400 parts per million. The scientific team set a pathway of global emissions reduction amounting to 7% annual emissions reduction across the globe to get us back to 350 parts per million by the end of the century. And that reduction must be coupled with reforestation and soil measures to draw carbon down out of the atmosphere. Now, this 7% annual reduction is not a figure set by our politicians. I have yet to see President Obama or any official in this country even ask what the climate system actually needs to restore balance. Instead, their starting point is what they think the politics will yield. And that calculus is largely still controlled by the very industry that has put us all in peril. Well, the carbon math I presented is not static. It's math in a minute glass. This number, 7%, gets higher, and therefore our energy descent steeper every single day we delay. Had we started back in 2005, scientists say that we could have cut our emissions just 3.5% a year in order to restore climate balance by the end of the century. In just 10 years of doing next to nothing, that 3.5% has climbed to 7% for this year. And if we delay reduction even 5 years, until 2020, scientists project that we would need to reduce emissions by 15% a year. And that may not be possible for global society to accomplish. So you can see that further delay will foreclose all other options than geoengineering, which is a truly terrifying prospect. What drives this time frame is nature's own tipping points. These are points of no return that would cause climate change to run completely out of our control. They exist because of several feedback loops in nature, such as the carbon bomb ticking in the vast permafrost spanning Siberia and Alaska. Our pollution has already heated the planet enough to start this permafrost melting. You can see the ponds forming. Well, if this melt really gets going, it would swamp our atmosphere with almost unfathomable amounts of greenhouse gases. And so now many of you are probably saying, well, we know all this. This is science. I thought she was supposed to talk about law. I am talking about law. This is the supreme law. Well, the point scientists make is that if we push this system too far, there's no coming back to safety, even if we subsequently reduce our emissions to zero. And there's just no way to sugarcoat this. Delay essentially locks the door on this heating planetary greenhouse that we've created, and it leaves our children and their children trapped inside to suffer deadly consequences that are quite foreseeable today and were quite foreseeable 30 years ago. Dr. James Hansen has warned failure to act with all deliberate speed functionally becomes a decision to eliminate the option of preserving a habitable climate system. Well, with many problems in society, lawyers take and others take a slow, incremental approach and see what works and they build from there, and that's advisable. With climate crisis, we have utterly run out of time. The danger that has smoldered now for decades has erupted into mind-blowing urgency. And so our legal approach must match the carbon math that nature imposes. If we fail to reduce our emissions enough, if we make some progress, but not enough, it won't matter that we tried very hard. A rescue rope that is too short is no good at all. As Winston Churchill famously said, it is not enough that we do our best. Sometimes we must do what is required. So when you go around and people say, well, at least some things are happening, stop yourself right there and ask, will you do the carbon math? The crisis requires rapid transition from fossil fuels to a fossil-free economy powered by safe, renewable energy. And this involves every sector of society. It can be done. That's the good news. But analysts now call for an emergency mobilization on the scale of World War II. Our government is well equipped to bring about this energy revolution, but it can't happen if our government remains idle. Well, 70 years ago, this nation mobilized for war almost overnight. But today, as Pope Francis writes, we lack leadership capable of striking out on new paths. The fact is, no political leader has stepped forward with a real plan needed to avoid calamity. This is not surprising for a country that has been commandeered by fossil fuel corporations. But if our broken politics won't work, can the law force change in time? I suggest it can, but not by using the same approaches that brought us this problem in the first place. So let me briefly describe the legal response to climate crisis so far, and then turn to an alternative approach underway that calls upon the courts to force action in time. Well, first let's touch on international efforts. Back in 1992, the U.S. joined nearly all other nations of the world in signing a convention that called for preventing dangerous climate change. And since that time, the world community has been trying to agree on binding greenhouse gas reductions. The Kyoto Protocol of 1997 made some progress, but the U.S. never signed it. And many nations that did sign on have not met their commitments. For decades, we have seen serial failures in international climate negotiations. And another round, as you all know, is coming up in Paris next month. Well, you might wonder why international law has been such a failure. The most basic reason is there's no superpower to define or enforce obligations. So the treaty negotiations are just that, negotiations. Domestic will has to be in place before an international agreement can even transpire. So let us turn to the domestic front in this country, where most officials are addressing climate crisis entirely within the structure of existing statutory law. For example, President Obama has released a clean power plan that will regulate coal-fired plants. There have been fuel mileage standards and other steps using existing statutes. But if we begin to even describe these efforts in any detail, I would drain the rest of my allocated time because they are so complex. What you need to know is that they fail to add up to anything close to the carbon reduction scientists say is needed. President Obama's energy regulation, even if implemented as designed, would yield less than 1/5 of the reduction rate minimally necessary to preserve a habitable planet. That is not to say that the Clean Power Plan is not important, but at this point, we need to do the math. And in that vein, we can't just look at the regulatory side of the Obama energy policy and ignore the other side, which aggressively pushes fossil fuels. The U.S. now produces more oil and gas than any other nation in the world. President Obama has opened up the public lands in the West for coal mining. He's opened up the Arctic and the eastern seaboard for offshore drilling. He promotes fracking all over the country. And in the Pacific Northwest, his administration has pushed over a dozen major export proposals to deliver fossil fuels from our country over to Asia. As one reporter says, this administration is on a drill, baby, drill course to increase production in every way imaginable on U.S. territory. And so while President Obama said in Alaska last month that our continued pollution, quote, will condemn our children to a planet beyond their capacity to repair, end quote, he is also taking a role in bringing about that very nightmare. And it is not as if he hasn't been told. A few years ago, his Secretary of Energy, Stephen Chu, told the LA Times, I don't think the American public has gripped in its gut what could happen. We're looking at a scenario where there's no more agriculture in California. I don't actually see how they can keep their cities going either. A few years ago, Richard Heinberg captured our situation when he wrote, the scale of what is at stake runs straight off the charts. The decisions that have to be made, and soon, may well determine whether civilization survives. Well, before relying on our statutory law to pull us out of climate crisis, we should explore why these state statutes have failed to force action for decades. Perhaps it is time to acknowledge that our statutory law is sorely overrated. So let's briefly take a moment to explore some of its dysfunction. Well, first, our environmental laws are micro in nature. They rarely focus agencies' attention on the big picture. They don't really even deal with the fact that air, soil, water, and species are interconnected. The statutes have forced agencies to operate in silos, and the view from those silos is dangerously myopic. Our statutes alone do not provide any sort of framework for an emergency response. Now, that is not to say that the Clean Air Act regulation wouldn't go far. It might. It's one tool. But to become a zero-carbon society, we need a full climate recovery plan with initiatives across the transportation, energy, building, food, and waste sectors using all of the tools government has available. And we need a price on carbon to flip the economic switch between fossil fuels and renewable energy. Second, we should recognize that while the statutes held early promise, federal and state officials across the board have turned environmental law inside out. They've taken laws intended to prohibit harm and turned them into broad systems legalizing harm. All of the fracking, offshore drilling, mountaintop removal, strip mining, and pollution spewing from stacks across this country, all that has been made legal under environmental statutory law. The current law gives agencies vast discretion to issue permits, and discretion acts like a magnet for industry influence. It is well understood that after prolonged political pressure, agencies become captured by the very industries they are supposed to regulate. In a captured agency, government officials view industry as a client they must serve. There are many, many good people working in government today, but even the most well-intentioned find themselves caught in this political cage. Moreover, within the political frame that now controls our environmental law, the burdens of pollution and resource damage fall disproportionately on the poor, those who have little or no voice in the dominant political system. There are countless communities in this country invisible to privileged society that are engulfed by waste dumps and chemical plants. These are like modern death camps for powerless residents who are all but sentenced to cancer from daily toxic poisoning. The environmental agencies legalize all of this, and the political frame treats it all as a legitimate outcome. A third shortcoming of the statutory system is that it is a statutory system. It fails to manifest fundamental constitutional rights. The statutes are created by Congress, and what Congress gives, it can also take away. So the next election could, well, roll back any progress made under statutory law. In order to hold legislatures accountable, the citizens need to have a constitutional grounding to their legal approach. A fourth deficiency is that our statutory system does nothing to address the consumption and waste that drives ecological damage. As Pope Francis wrote in the encyclical, society is gripped with a disordered desire to consume more than what is really necessary. The statutory laws of this country were born out of the technocratic state, and they reflect its assumptions. Rather than question the industrial practices that drive society towards collapse, our statutes only deal with the symptoms of the economic industrial age, primarily by requiring technology controls on pollution. These controls run a very nuanced gamut from, I'll give you a few legal terms, from best control technology to best available technology to best available control technology to best available control measures, best available demonstrated technology, best available retrofit technology, best demonstrated achievable technology, and many, many others. Those are all legal requirements. Do you see the obvious distinctions between those? Yeah? And yet, despite all of this technology, today, nearly all streams in this country are laced with toxic mercury, and American babies are born polluted with a cocktail of toxins already in their bloodstream. Fish advisories for toxic contamination are in effect for 1 in every 4 rivers in the United States. But rather than phase out permits to pollute, EPA's solution is to issue more and more fish advisories warning people not to eat fish. In fact, to remind you of the need to consult fish advisories before you eat your catch of the day, EPA offers this complimentary magnet for your refrigerator with a little blue fish that says with a smile, "Fish for your health," but then it warns, some fish may be high in contaminants. Use EPA's website to contact your health department about local fish advisories. So the great family tradition of going out to fish has boiled down to an exercise in Googling toxins. And a final shortcoming is that our statutory system has left the public behind by creating stifling complexity. Agencies use a vocabulary of acronyms that blather an alphabetic mix meaningless to the public. A mother protesting a toxic facility near her children's school, for example, might find herself having to speak in terms of ARARs, MCLs, NESHAP, SIPs, MACT, BEDACT, and BACT. Do you know what those mean? Few incoherencies impede democracy more so than the utter lack of accessible language by which citizens can hold their government officials accountable. And these acronyms also scour all moral implications from the law. actions that might well be described as relentless assaults against a community or reckless endangerment of innocent children all succumb to an antiseptic terminology of our technocratic regulatory system. For decades now, this dehumanizing jargon has sedated the public to the mounting threat of ecological collapse, to the extent that now society's most destructive inclinations gain acceptance as if they are normal. Well, citizens are finally waking up to recognize our government's misuse of the statutes. Peaceful protests are growing all across this country, and in my region, they're directed against the fossil fuel export proposals that stand to be permitted under these environmental laws. Citizens have blocked railroad tracks and turned back oil trains. They have surrounded Shell oil drilling rigs with their kayaks on Puget Sound and Portland Harbor. They've blocked huge trucks carrying megaloads of equipment to the tar sands of Canada. This is not some fringe movement. This is a rising tide of citizens across the country who feel compelled to stand up against government policy that endangers their children. And to me, it indicates that our system of statutory laws is disintegrating. So we're going to turn the corner now and talk about another approach. But I want to end this discussion of statutory law by saying in my book, I describe it as the cane upon which humanity leans as it walks the plank towards its own destruction. And yet I do want to be very clear. I'm not suggesting that we throw out our environmental laws. These laws do provide many of the tools we need to achieve rapid carbon reduction. The problem lies with the larger frame in which these laws are administered. We have looked to statutory law as an end-all solution. And as Pope Francis urges, we need to recognize the root problems that push us towards destruction. This is a much bigger problem than environmental law. Our crisis mirrors an anthropocentric worldview, a corporate culture of sheer greed, and an individual code of conduct that walks through daily life oblivious to the consequences of consumption. The challenge is to create a full paradigm shift across all realms: legal, economic, social, and moral. Pope Francis calls for nothing less than a transformative ecological culture, a way of thinking, a lifestyle, and spirituality, which together generate resistance to the assault of the technical paradigm, he writes. So let us now turn our attention to a legal frame that may help answer this call. I call it nature's trust. As a concept, it starts with the laws of nature and works to develop a legal framework coherent with reality. The paradigm of nature's trust builds from a principle called the public trust doctrine. Now, this isn't some new principle. It is on the shelf waiting for you to grab it and pull it down and use it. It's not something we're making up here today. It's there, but it's not in the realm of statutory law. This doctrine voices the universal wisdom essential to human survival and social stability. It requires government to protect crucial natural resources for all present and future generations as an enduring trust or perpetual endowment, so to speak. The public trust doctrine traces back through court cases to the very beginning of our nation, but its true origins reach far deeper. Professor Charles Wilkinson writes, the real headwaters of the public trust doctrine arise in rivulets from all reaches of the basin that holds the societies of the world. The trust concept is manifest in indigenous systems worldwide, in the Roman institutes of Justinian, and in the Magna Carta of England. Many nations around the world embrace this doctrine as the central principle of their legal systems. Moored in property law, not statutory law, the public trust affirms lasting community property rights in crucial natural resources. You might imagine all the resources essential to our human welfare and survival, including the waters and the wildlife and the air, as being held together in one legal package that I call nature's trust. Through the ages, courts have said that the beneficiaries of this trust are all present and future generations of citizens. You all have a common property right in this trust. And because, as Pope Francis declared to the United Nations last week, any harm done to the environment is harm done to humanity, the beneficiaries of nature's trust must really be all species and their ecosystems too. Government officials are trustees who must manage the public trust for the endurance of the nation and the natural world. They cannot use their power to allow one generation or its industry to consume the natural wealth needed by all people now and to come. That would govern for the expiration, not the endurance of the nation. In its deepest sense, then, the trust represents a restraint on government power. It is a human right born from the logic that citizens never give their government the power to destroy what is essential to their survival and prosperity. The Lodestar case announcing this principle was Illinois Central Railroad, decided in 1872 by the Supreme Court. And the court confronted a situation it had never seen before. The Illinois legislature had conveyed the entire Chicago shoreline of Lake Michigan to a private railroad company. And yet this was shoreline that the citizens needed for their fishing and navigation and commerce. And the court held the legislature simply didn't have the power to make that conveyance. Granting away crucial resources, it said, would be a grievance which never could be long borne by a free people. The integral power of the trust is that it provides a new frame through which to assess government actions and whether they are legitimate. When government officials act out of sheer self-interest to benefit their political allies, they violate the basic fiduciary duty of loyalty, which all trustees are held to. So what is often viewed within government itself as the controlling political reality may be exposed through the trust frame as extraordinary malfeasance. Moreover, this principle of law resides at a much deeper level than statutory law. It has the constitutional force necessary to hold legislatures accountable. You should think of the trust as a yardstick against which our statutes are measured. By enforcing the trust, courts prevent any one set of legislatures from wielding so much power over ecology as to cripple future society. The reasoning of the public trust puts it on par with the highest political liberties of citizens living in a free society. It wards off ecological tyranny. Well, nearly 2 years ago, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court invoked the public trust to overturn a statute passed by your state legislature to promote fracking. Chief Justice Castile applied the public trust as a constitutional principle to protect the ecology supporting your communities. He declared that citizens hold inherent and indefeasible rights that are of such general, great, and essential quality as to be ensconced as inviolate. That is a historic landmark opinion rendered right here in Pennsylvania. The constitutional public trust imposes obligations on government that you see stand independent of statutes. Primarily, the government must protect your trust resources. This is so basic. You would not allow your trustee to bankrupt your trust. Looking always to nature's requirements, trustees must prevent substantial impairment to trust assets. That comes right out of the court cases. And courts make very clear that this duty of protection is active, not passive. Trustees can't just sit idle and let the public's trust assets be destroyed on their watch, which pretty much describes government's climate approach. Unlike the statutory laws, which speak in techno-jargon, the trust frame situates the law in a much broader moral dialogue by announcing a covenant that we have with our children and all generations to come to protect the life-sustaining earth endowment. As Pope Francis writes, the world we have received also belongs to those who will follow us. The trust principle in law promotes the understanding that our resource use today affects the natural inheritance that we owe our children and grandchildren. And in this way, the trust covenant promotes sobriety and care in daily consumption. This trust principle also carries deep religious connotations. Surveys of Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam all suggest a sacred trust giving rise to holy covenants of obligation towards future generations and to all of creation. A Jewish prayer, for example, iterates God's command to Adam, saying, "This is the last world I shall make. I place it in your hands. Hold it in trust." Pope Francis described a sacred trust when he said, Creation is not some possession that we can lord over for our own pleasure, nor even less is it the property of only some people. Creation is the marvelous gift that God has given us so that we will take care of it and harness it for the benefit of all. The legal paradigm of nature's trust falls uniquely into this processional of religious teaching. And when the law's injunctions mirror religious and moral instruction, society gains a powerful symbiosis and alignment and a renewed steadiness and purpose. Judges who hold the power of the pen can once again breathe life into the law by expressing an unassailable moral foundation. But by contrast, technocratic commands tend to catch the winds of greed that seem to blow incessantly through the living generations on earth. So while we should not think of any legal principle as a panacea for our crisis, I do believe the trust presents a powerful frame that summons transformation from both within and outside the law. The trust approach calls for protection of ecology according to nature's own requirements. It directly confronts the permit system that favors politically powerful interests. It presents constitutional rights. It makes a moral call to measure our own consumption against our children's inheritance. And it has the galvanizing logic and populist manifesto that can stir the public once again to protect our common home. And on the international level, at a time when climate negotiations seem incapable of success, the public trust offers clear principles of reciprocal obligation that are recognizable to nations throughout the world. The atmosphere is a planetary trust asset held in common by all sovereign states who must jointly act as co-trustees and each subject to a fiduciary obligation to protect our climate system. So we don't have to make up something new to address our climate crisis. The premises are already there, but they have been utterly lost in the modern era of statutory law. Everybody dealing with climate gravitates to statutory law in government. I'd like to end my remarks by describing a global legal campaign called atmospheric trust litigation that invokes this public trust to force an urgent climate response. Well, atmospheric trust litigation, which I call ATL, was launched 4 years ago by the Eugene-based nonprofit Our Children's Trust. And lawsuits and petitions were filed in every state across this country on the same day, and in other countries as well, all of them on behalf of youth plaintiffs. This approach was born from the reality that the climate problem needs a macro response tied to the actual requirements of nature. So the idea is to push through litigation an integrated framework of carbon reduction before it's too late. This litigation asserts a very simple premise, that youth hold a constitutional public trust right to inherit a stable atmosphere necessary for their survival. And trustees worldwide must prevent substantial impairment of the common trust property, the atmosphere. So that duty boils down to carbon math that I explained earlier. All the cases demand that the federal and state trustees produce carbon recovery plans that will carry out the percentage annual reduction in their own jurisdiction. And what percent is that this year? What percent is that this year? This is something we need to know. 7. The courts are not asked to develop these plans. That's the trustees' job, after all. But courts can force the trustees to simply do their job and devise a plan and then implement it under the court's continuing supervision. So it's not a usurping role for courts, but rather a supervisory role. And courts have played such a role many times throughout history, including in the civil rights era. We might wonder, why are youth turning to the courts for help? Why not Congress? Why not state legislatures? Well, remember, for decades, the climate problem has been left to the legislatures and the agencies. And those branches are still pursuing policies that will cook this planet. We have 3 branches of government, not 2. The Founding Fathers created the 3rd branch for a reason, to safeguard the fundamental rights of citizens. Courts are a last resort, but a resort nonetheless. So at this 11th hour, we need our full government to focus strategic attention on the climate emergency. Federal and state judges can order swift injunctive relief with one signing of the pen that brings focus to the chaos of our political situation. But without such intervention, Will our politicians take urgent action against the very corporations that fund them? A few years back, the President's science advisor told the world the current situation of the world in relation to the climate problem is that we're in a car with bad brakes driving towards a cliff in the fog. We really should imagine the world's children trapped in that car. Do we not want a police officer to stop that car before it plunges over the climate cliff? If we say that courts have no role in this emergency, we must also be willing to take ownership of the conclusion that flows from that scenario. Well, the ATL cases are now moving through the legal system, and NASA scientist Jim Hansen says that judicial relief in these cases may be the best, the last, and at this late stage, the only real chance to preserve a habitable planet for young people and future generations. But some of the early cases were dismissed by judges who said that climate crisis was a problem for the other branches, the agencies and legislatures. Well, how right that is. The point is that those branches are shirking their duties. We cannot solve our climate crisis by continuing to treat it as a game of hot potato. More recently, as climate headlines worsen, judges are stepping into their role. Just 2 months ago, 2 landmark victories were handed down in different parts of the world within a day of each other in climate cases brought by citizens against their government. In the Netherlands, the court found the Dutch government's climate action plan was wholly inadequate to meet the scale of the threat, and it ordered the government to slash emissions 25% within 5 years. 5,000 miles away in Washington state, a judge handed youth a victory, even though they had sued their governor. This is Governor Inslee with the plaintiffs that sued him. And that court said the government must take adequate steps. And yet in another case decided in Pakistan just days ago, the court ordered the government to take climate action according to time frames set by the court and said that the delay and lethargy of the state offend the fundamental rights of the citizens. Well, similar atmospheric trust cases are teed up all across this country and in a growing number of other countries as well. And one was filed just 2 weeks ago in this state by Our Children's Trust and the Widener Law School Clinic on behalf of 6 Pennsylvania youth against Governor Tom Wolf and several state agencies. Pennsylvania young people, this is your case, and this is one of your plaintiffs. You can support this case in tangible ways, if you want to, by connecting with Our Children's Trust. These cases across the country are gaining momentum. The point to be made is that civic action in response to this emergency doesn't just mean voting or writing letters to agencies and Congress. Sometimes it means suing your government. Well, the youth of this world now need the judicial dominoes to start falling in their favor and falling fast enough to meet the deadlines set by nature. There's a huge and historic case against President Obama and his multiple agencies now being briefed in the Federal District Court of Oregon, and that famous climate scientist Jim Hansen is actually a plaintiff in the case with his granddaughter, and he is plaintiff representing as guardian future generations of humanity. The youth plaintiffs have asked the judge to order the administration to devise a plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in accordance with the best available science. Note, this is the very same thing members of Congress asked for when they wrote to EPA 30 years ago. The difference is that this time, a plan would be developed and implemented under the supervision of the third branch of government. If a favorable ruling in this case happened before the Paris negotiations, it could be an international game changer because it would announce U.S. obligation into what is otherwise a free-for-all negotiation. Well, in these last few moments, let us reflect briefly on how religion could reinforce these legal efforts. While we have a formal separation of church and state in this country, religion in fact plays a crucial role in law by announcing moral behavior to society. Our Children's Trust is the climate organization using the encyclical message in its legal actions. When religious leaders call upon us all to protect God's creation as a sacred trust, And when that appeal parallels the secular duty ingrained in public trust law, that powerful pairing may embolden judges to rise to their historic role. There's been a groundswell of support for the atmospheric trust litigation campaign from Catholic organizations and individuals through amicus briefs, funding assistance, organizing, press support, and through inspired Catholic youth answering the call of the encyclical by stepping forward as plaintiffs in this huge federal case. But the litigation needs a lot more support because, after all, it is trying to save the whole planet. And in the totality of things, too, we need to recognize that while atmospheric trust litigation may provide a catalyst for urgent climate action, legal movements need backing from a moral culture that inspires support and respect from the people. Any law trying to protect nature stands to be devoured by our present culture of consumption. As Pope Francis observes, we should not think that the force of law will be sufficient when the culture itself is corrupt. But if the Catholic people of this world and other people of goodwill answer the Pope's call for a true ecological culture and model the same frugal dignity that Pope Francis does in his daily life, they may just form that critical mass needed for society's great cultural transformation before it is too late. Let me summarize and close now by suggesting that the Pope's call for a new and universal solidarity among Earth citizens summons the public trust principle from the field of law. Not simply a righteous legal premise for the protection of ecology, its moral and religious voice speaks to fundamental purposes that have long since been lost in this modern era, tapping a human understanding that remains instinctive, passion-bound, and deeply shared among citizens of distant cultures. The trust covenant lives in the hearts of all humanity. The same trust principles that flow through a judge's pen can be preached from a pulpit or spoken as the last words from a grandmother to her grandchildren anywhere in the world, because the trust transcends all governments, cultures, and peoples on earth. That sacred trust of religion and law must now ignite humanity to confront the crisis of ecology. Nature's trust sounds a clarion call in churches, mosques, temples, synagogues, and prayer lodges all over the world to save creation. This call echoes in the blasted hollows of Appalachia, in the fracked communities of Pennsylvania, in the cancer alleys along the Mississippi corridor, and at the base of immortal mountains that weep their last glaciers into the sea. It summons people of faith everywhere to rise up and defend the holy sanctuary of earth, and in unison to assert not the power of life, but the trust of life. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Mary, thank you very much. Wow, my goodness, what a challenge, an imaginative explanation of what we can do. As a conference chair, I want to take the privilege of, we've got wiggle room in our schedule this morning. I'd like to have Jane lead a Q&A for about 15 minutes. We'll stretch the session a little bit further. Okay, Jane? And if I could maybe begin with a question, Jane, to you, sorry, Mary. Phenomenal presentation, really imaginative, moving, highly challenging. And I love the practicality of it. So can I ask the simple question from Western Pennsylvania at this conference? What can we do?
That is the question. The first thing I say is do something, do anything, just don't do nothing. So if we wake up tomorrow and do the same thing we did today. That's called business as usual. And you know what that means. So the first thing is to change our mindset and to keep the focus. The real climate problem we have is lack of focus, because people hear these things and then they go on and do their daily actions. So the first thing to keep in mind is focus, and preferably wake up in the middle of the night worried about this problem. That helps with the focus. Now, in terms of practicalities, we can add some things up. We need government. We can't do this without government because our whole energy infrastructure is controlled largely by government. So does everybody agree in this room we need government? Number two, does everybody agree we have 3 branches of government? Not everybody agrees. That's interesting. Okay. Number 3, do we realize we have 2 levels of government, federal and state? So number 4, do we realize that democracy is not a spectator sport? And that democracy depends on citizens to engage and influence and control. Citizens have to control their government. Not corporations, but citizens. So if we believe in those 4 things, then the next task is for us to figure out, with our focus, how we wake up tomorrow and what we choose to do with our time to solve this crisis. Now, I'm going to get to the practicalities, but let me first warn you. A lot of people turn away from the crisis because they know that the world, they know they can't save the world. And so they wake up tomorrow worried but distracted. That's a big problem. That's the focus problem. Because they know they can't save the whole world, so they don't even try to do their part. Let me tell you, you can't save the whole world alone. But the whole world can't be saved without you. And that was the magic of the mobilization of World War II. Every single person stepped up. School children, people in churches, nurses, doctors, whatever anybody's role was, whatever they were talented at, they stepped forth and they used that to this end of finally achieving peace. So that's what we've got to do. And while I've talked about law and citizenship, I do want to say some of you may have other talents that you can use. We could really use a good battery these days. So engineers in the room, focus on that, but keep your focus. Now, as citizens, with these three different branches and 2 different levels, what I have tried to impress upon everybody is that while most people gravitate towards their legislatures and sometimes agencies, there is only a brief moment of time to turn this situation around. And I believe that will require, and I cannot emphasize enough, I believe it will require the 3rd branch of government, the court. If we went back 20 years, we would have been focusing on these other branches. But if we have to achieve this 7% reduction per year globally, which we can, it will take focus on the part of government. You can write all the letters you want to Congress, and I think you should. But those letters aren't going to provide what? Focus. Now, if there's a court injunction that forces the other branches to simply do their job and create a climate recovery plan, that provides the focus needed. The court doesn't write the plan. It forces the other branches to do their work. And so, if you want to support this litigation, that is supporting this 3rd branch of government, know that there are cases teed up in every single state, and this one in Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania case to ATL is like Iowa to the national elections. This case is huge. Do you know why? Because it was your Supreme Court that announced this incredible constitutional underpinning of the public trust 2 years ago. Everybody is looking to your state and your public trust case that's been brought by youth plaintiffs. How do regular people support that? I mean, don't lawyers just go to court and you just sit back and watch the outcome? No. Judges need judicial courage to resolve these cases and order a plan. Where do judges get judicial courage? Judges are people. They're very isolated people, I warn you. They're very isolated. You can't just go lobby a judge and show up and say, hey, judge, I want to have a meeting with you. I think this case should come out this way. Do not try to do that. But judges are people. They need judicial courage. How do you influence this? You influence this by talking everywhere you can about atmospheric trust litigation and the trust right that the young people have. By writing letters to the editor in the papers all across Pennsylvania, judges read letters to the editor. By student groups getting together and writing opinion editorials that are longer letters that are published in the newspaper. Students are doing that at my children's high school in Eugene, Oregon, to influence the federal case. By bringing groups together, as Catholic organizations have done, to submit amicus briefs. These are briefs written by organizations or professionals. They're called friend of the court briefs or amicus briefs. And they're written by non-parties to influence the judge. It's the equivalent of, I guess, the letter to your congressperson. So that's incredible when Catholic organizations get together, as they have done in some of this litigation, to write amicus briefs supporting the litigation. The federal district court case, even though it's all the way over in Oregon, could really use some amicus briefs by Catholic organizations. Those are some tangible ways, but just simply talking about it, gets around town, gets it across in the culture of expectation that citizens have in their local democracy. Apart from that, there are also ways to just simply go to city council locally and ask for a city ordinance to implement the 7%. The Eugene Youth, organized by Our Children's Trust, testified to their city council. My little 8-year-old went time after time after time. He would go up to city council, and our city council has 3 minutes of public testimony, and he would say his name, and he'd give his testimony, and then he'd say, and I will be back next month to testify again. And those kids came back and back and back and back, and they achieved what they wanted to. The city council passed the most aggressive climate recovery ordinance in the nation. Now we're hoping in Eugene, Oregon, to show people how to live with this 7% reduction. So those are some tangible ways. It's bringing the concept out to the culture, sending it around, tweeting it, Facebooking it, putting pictures out, everything you can possibly think of to get it out as an expectation of democracy. Yeah?
Manager strategic. I work a lot in energy infrastructure in the developing countries. I also have part of my early life, I was part of the MCI antitrust lawsuits that broke up the monopoly of AT&T. And underpinning the case we won to have the legal right to be in business, and I'm not a lawyer, nor am I an environmental lawyer, was that because the monopoly had been granted by the federal government to AT&T, the fact that they acted in a predatory manner was the grounds of which we were allowed to go into court. And as you were talking, I was thinking both of the numerous ways in my business career that I've used antitrust and racketeering, and have used the courts of Northern Virginia, Eastern District, Southern District, New York, and Chicago. Those federal dockets are rocket dockets. And I've also used a tactic of, I'm not going to worry about a lot of discovery because what I got here, I got here. So you want to carry out a long discovery? I don't think so. Now that's been obviously company to company. But I'm wondering, I mean, I may be very naive because I really don't know this area of law or the area of law that you're suing on here. But might aspects of predatoriness and racketeering, that is, people who are breaking the law who have the same predatory impact over here.
Okay, so let me address this question and comment. First of all, let me clarify, I'm not a lawyer in this litigation. I talk about a lot, I write about a lot, but I'm not a lawyer in the litigation, so just to clarify that. Now, you should know, this should give you some hope, but it should not slow you down. It should speed up your efforts. You should know that there is momentum in all sorts of quarters right now in the law and outside of the law. It is incredible. I've never seen so much momentum. It is as if we're all pushing this huge rock up the hill and we're gaining. But rather than some people say, oh, well, it looks like it's going well, I'm going to go take a vacation, that's when you need to bring up others to push the rock over the hill, because there's actually a chance now. 2 years ago, I was thinking there wasn't. One of the areas of momentum is this idea of racketeering. Leading scientists of the world have now called upon the Justice Department to start an investigation into potential racketeering charges by the fossil fuel corporations, particularly Exxon. Because that first slide, one of the first slides I showed you was that letter to Congress, and then I said they manufactured doubt and they knew 30 years ago. That just came out last week, that they knew 30 years ago. It was an investigative report by Inside Climate News. You can look it up on the internet, read all about it. There's a 3-page summary. And that may well provide the basis for racketeering charges. Now, that is in play. Divestment. There are entire movements to divest universities from their fossil fuel holdings and divest companies and churches of fossil fuel holdings. That is a huge bruise to the industry. If you understand what has to happen, we have to go from fossil fuels to safe renewable energy within a very short period of time. So it's going to take all these areas of momentum. Students are very engaged in divestment, and that is a very productive use of your time as well. The reason I focus on ATL, atmospheric trust, is because I talk to citizens. I don't usually talk to expert lawyers in racketeering. However, because you are here, I would highly recommend you look into it and offer your help and your expertise, because these lawyers, you may know something they don't. Right now they're focusing on New York, but that's obviously your calling. Okay. Yeah, and for public defenders, I must say, there's a lot of people who are looking at court cases because they sat in front of an oil train peacefully. Most environmental law professors now say without peaceful, and I emphasize peaceful, civil disobedience, there won't be pressure on government to accomplish what it must. And so public defender types who are not environmental lawyers, they have this special expertise in defense. So, yeah. Yeah. I'll go to another table next, I promise.
Richard Miller, Creighton University. I just finished Naomi Klein's book, and it was news to me, the power of, basically the one that kind of caught me was in Canada, when Canada, indigenous people preserved this idea that the treaties among indigenous people were based upon the fact that their lifestyle, their worldview of fishing, hunting, a preserved environment was necessary, must be upheld to uphold the treaty. And basically she suggests that indigenous peoples hold great power for at least blocking things in the short term. I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I teach federal Indian law, and let me tell you, we wouldn't have this problem if federal Indian law were just applied by the courts. The treaties protect the Indian way of life here too. They are property rights. There's a trust obligation that's called the Indian Trust Obligation towards tribes to protect their unique lifeways and property rights. If courts would enforce that, that would probably take this problem 90% of the way to being resolved, actually. However, that has become convoluted over the last 20 years because federal courts have said that obligation is no greater than the statutory obligations to tribes, which is, I think, clearly a wrong result. That's the result courts have come out with. So now we face the reality, people, that judges come out with bad decisions sometimes. And so judges don't always do what citizens ask them to do or what tribes ask them to do. But as lawyers, we're used to that. And it may shock some people. Some people hear of an adverse decision and they say, oh, it's all over. No, as lawyers, we look at the entire framework. We look at these ATL cases teed up in 50 states, or petitions and then cases teed up in 50 states, and more countries coming on, and there are a few adverse decisions in those. It's the trend. It's like stockbrokers. They look at, they'll always tell you, stock's down today, but the trend is up. Have you ever been told that? And so you look at the momentum gained. Now, in the case of Indian law, that's quite a bit of bad case law in this country. But I will say, as an Indian law professor, that the treaty rights should prevent the damage that carbon dioxide emissions are causing under the trust and the treaty rights. And so, tribes in my region, treaty rights are huge. Every conference, every environmental conference has a tribal speaker, practically, and that's an area of law that I know they're looking into as well.
We have time for one more question.
Yes, you, yeah.
I might diverge a little bit because we're talking about very big things. Fiona, I'm in pharmacy school, and I'm a mother of a 7-year-old. And I want to make a comment of something we can do at home. I like the word frugal very much. I grew up in a very poor country. And my question to you as a mother that you mentioned is, how do we improve awareness of our children to this when they're continuously bombarded with buy another toy, do this more. And I, as a parent, feel like I'm just pushing against a wave of information that not necessarily helps this. So what's your suggestion? Because when they go to school, they consume. When they come home, they consume. When they see another toy, they want it. We have different rules in our house, and sometimes I'm a totally bad guy. No, I'm not buying you another plastic toy because you didn't break the first one. But how do you move that into their awareness that you're accepting of what the reality is?
Oh, thank you for that question. I am delighted to end this conference on that, or my talk on that one question. So that's the perfect question, is how do we as parents change the lifestyle and the culture that is constantly, that our kids are bombarded with. And so you have to, and I'm speaking personally now, this isn't the law professor, you have to back out of the mainstream culture and create your own culture with your own neighbors and the parents of your kids' friends. And so what that means is you don't shop. You don't shop. My kids, ask my kids how many times they've been to a mall. We did go to a mall for a movie a few years ago, and there was an escalator, and they just freaked out. They rode the escalator up and down. Now, you may think we're weird and live some strange lifestyle. We try to grow as much food as we can. We don't go to the grocery store for food like most people do. We buy directly from farmers. I can over 500 jars of things, peaches, jams, tomatoes a year. I put frozen vegetables up. We buy everything directly from the makers of those raw materials. I'm going to go back to Oregon, and this weekend I'm going to go to Farmers Market, and I'm going to negotiate with 5 farmers to buy over 300 pounds of roots. And I'm going to put those in my root cellar, and hopefully my husband is going out and getting some gunny sack bags from coffee houses to do that. I'm not the only one. Let me tell you that when you start breaking out of the commercial lifestyle, and the first way is to just simply not shop. And the first way is to figure out how you produce your own food from scratch, how you preserve your winter food supply over the course of the winter. Once you start doing that, it's addictive and it's contagious. It is both. And so you will see your friends doing that, and then your kids will be growing up, because your friends will have kids that are friends with your kids, and then they're going to be growing up with this culture. Before I left on the plane, I wanted something to eat on the plane the next morning. I got up at 3 o'clock in the morning yesterday, and I smelled something delicious in the kitchen. And I realized my son, 17 years old, had a friend over. They were baking zucchini bread because they didn't want this huge zucchini from our garden to go to waste. And so I took that zucchini bread and ate it on the plane. So we don't use packaged, we try not to use plastic, period. Now, what can you do every day if you're not a parent? And I realize you just have to pull your kids out of that. That means you're not going to be the soccer mom. It means they're probably not, they're going to do different sports with different kids. But how do you do if you're not a parent? You make comments constantly on waste. And I'll finish up here, Jane. That if you order a drink, I noticed, of water or cranberry juice, most people here in Pennsylvania give you a straw. Now, that wouldn't happen, I don't think, most places in Eugene, because the culture now knows we don't use straws. Nobody needs a straw to drink, and it's wasteful. And so if you just say, please, before you order, I don't want the straw, those kinds of things replicated thousands of times by the citizens actually make a difference. So with that, that is the culture I'm talking about. Wake up every day and be a citizen, but also change the culture. Thank you so very much.